There are moments in the human journey when the heart becomes heavy, when life feels like a storm that keeps returning, and when the soul struggles to understand the wisdom behind what it is experiencing. In these moments, many of us turn inward, and instead of turning to the source of comfort, we turn against Him within our own hearts. This quiet, often unnoticed habit of carrying complaints against Allah, complaints not of dir'ah, but of blame, resentment, or internal accusations, slowly eats away at the light inside us. It dims our clarity, disrupts our peace, and distances us from the one who has only ever given us what is ultimately for our good. Today, I want to explore a truth that is often hidden behind our pain, that sikwah from Allah is not simply a reaction to hardship. It is a reflection of our spiritual health. And when the heart allows complaint to settle where trust should be, it experiences a kind of emptiness that no worldly relief can fill. There is a quiet danger in carrying grievances against the most merciful, a danger that affects our connection, our resilience, and our ability to see the world with hope. Let us take a deep breath and allow ourselves to look inward with honesty. Let us understand not for the sake of guilt, but for the sake of growth. Because when the heart realigns with its Creator, even the heaviest storms become bearable, and the soul finds a strength it never knew it. Had complaining against Allah weakens the heart's spiritual grounding and erodes inner reliance, not because Allah requires our praise or gratitude, but because the human heart itself was created to function through trust, surrender, and connection with its Creator. When that connection is disrupted by internal complaint, what is truly damaged is not the divine relationship in its eternal truth, but the human capacity to draw strength, healing, and stability from the one who created every pathway of serenity within the soul. The heart by its nature is a vessel meant to hold certainty. It was never designed to thrive on resentment or quiet rebellion. When sikwah toward Allah settles into that vessel, it becomes like a shadow that dims the heart's ability to recognize blessings, guidance, and the unseen help that constantly surrounds a believer. The very foundations of spiritual grounding begin to loosen, because grounding comes from the certainty that whatever comes from Allah carries wisdom, even when that wisdom is beyond us in the moment. The weakening begins subtly. A person may not even notice when their internal dialogue shifts from, "Oh Allah, help me," to "Why would you do this to me?" It is the shift from seeking refuge in Allah to emotionally withdrawing from Him. And this shift carries consequences, because turning away from the source of strength leaves the heart exposed to the weight of hardship without spiritual protection. Hardship then feels heavier, pain feels sharper, and loneliness feels more absolute. Not because the situation changed, but because the heart lost its anchor. Reliance on Allah is not simply a religious ideal, it is a psychological and spiritual necessity. Just as a physical body cannot stand without bones, the inner self cannot stand without a foundation of trust in its Creator. When the heart begins to carry complaint against Allah, it becomes spiritually fragile. This fragility shows itself in many forms. Sometimes it appears as impatience, where the person can no longer tolerate even small discomforts because the heart is drained of divine reassurance. Sometimes it appears as emotional instability because inner complaint disrupts the deep calm that comes from knowing that one is cared for by the most compassionate. And sometimes it appears as a loss of direction, where a person feels purposeless because they can no longer see themselves as guided or supported by Allah. All of these internal experiences are symptoms of a single root, the erosion of trust. Trust is not only a feeling, it is a lens. It determines how we see difficulty, how we interpret our struggles, and how we move through pain. When trust is strong, hardship becomes a bridge to closeness, a means of purification, and an avenue for growth. But when trust weakens because complaint has replaced surrender, hardship is interpreted as abandonment, punishment, or unfairness. Nothing has changed except the state of the heart. Yet this change transforms the entire spiritual experience of life. This is why sikwah is so harmful, because it reshapes our spiritual realities from the inside out. Another way the heart's grounding weakens is through the gradual loss of gratitude. Gratitude is not only a response to blessings, it is an inner posture that shapes how the heart perceives the world. A grateful heart sees even small blessings as gifts and sees difficulties as opportunities to grow closer to Allah. But a heart occupied with complaint becomes blind to blessings. It begins to take what is good for granted while magnifying what is difficult. The mind becomes occupied with what is missing, what went wrong, or what feels unfair. And this mental pattern slowly conditions the heart to dwell in negativity, even in moments when goodness still surrounds it. Gratitude and complaint cannot coexist in the same space. One pushes the other out. When complaint becomes dominant, the heart loses its ability to recognize the mercy embedded in every moment. And this blindness weakens reliance even further. Sikwah also disrupts the heart's ability to feel humility. Humility is not about belittling oneself. It is about recognizing one's place in relation to Allah, understanding that Allah's knowledge is infinite while ours is limited. When a heart is humble, it accepts that it may not understand everything, but it trusts the one who does. Complaint against Allah is often rooted in an unspoken expectation that life should unfold according to our design. When things deviate from that design, the heart feels wronged, as if life owes it a specific outcome. This mindset turns hardship into a personal grievance instead of a test or an opportunity. Without humility, the heart becomes rigid, unable to accept the unfolding of divine decree. And without acceptance, reliance becomes nearly impossible. A person cannot rely on what they do not trust or feel at peace with. Reliance on Allah is meant to be the believer's refuge. It is the emotional space where the heart rests, knowing that it is not alone in navigating the uncertainties of life. But complaint erodes this refuge. The heart that complains internally against Allah cannot fully surrender to Him because part of it is resisting His decree. This resistance creates tension within the soul, a kind of inner conflict where the person wants ease but cannot embrace the process that leads to it. This tension drains spiritual energy, leaving the believer feeling tired, scattered, and emotionally overwhelmed. Furthermore, sikwah affects the believer's resilience. Resilience is not the absence of pain, it is the ability to remain spiritually intact while moving through pain. A heart anchored in trust can bear much because it draws strength from the certainty that Allah is with it. But a heart burdened with complaint loses this strength. It becomes emotionally brittle, unable to carry trials with grace or patience. The trials themselves do not become harder, but the capacity of the heart to carry them diminishes. This diminished capacity becomes another layer of suffering on top of the original hardship. What could have been a moment of elevation becomes a moment of spiritual collapse, not because the burden was too great, but because the heart was too weakened by complaint to carry it. Sikwah also interferes with the believer's ability to make dua with sincerity. Dua thrives on hope. It requires the heart to believe that the one it is calling upon is listening, caring, and responding. But when complaint settles inside, the heart begins to doubt its own prayers. Will Allah help me? Does Allah want good for me? Why hasn't my dua been answered? These doubts are not simply theological questions. They are emotional wounds created by inner resentment. When the heart doubts the mercy of the one it prays to, its dua becomes hollow. The tongue may speak, but the heart is not present. And this lack of presence steals the sweetness of connection that dua is meant to bring. Another impact of sikwah is that it strengthens the ego's voice. Hardship often humbles the soul, making it more receptive to divine guidance. But when hardship leads to complaint, the ego uses this vulnerability to assert itself. I deserve better. My life should not be like this. This situation is unfair. The ego thrives on the illusion of control, and complaint feeds that illusion. When the ego becomes dominant, the heart becomes resistant to surrender. It sees surrender not as a path to peace, but as a threat to its perceived autonomy. This internal struggle further distances the heart from reliance on Allah, because reliance requires the ego to soften and yield. Sikwah also damages spiritual grounding by weakening the believer's sense of perspective. Hardship often feels overwhelming because the human mind naturally magnifies pain when it lacks spiritual clarity. But a heart connected to Allah sees beyond the moment. It understands that life is a journey, that trials are temporary, and that every difficulty carries meaning. When complaint enters the heart, this perspective narrows. Life becomes defined by the present hardship. The mind begins to create narratives of despair. Things will never improve. My situation is hopeless. My life is ruined. These narratives are not reflections of reality. They are the consequences of a heart disconnected from its source of hope. Moreover, complaining against Allah disables the heart's ability to experience contentment. Contentment does not mean that life is always easy. It means that the heart is at peace even when life is difficult. It is one of the greatest gifts Allah places in the heart of a believer. But complaint replaces contentment with restlessness. It creates a constant feeling of dissatisfaction even when outward circumstances improve. The heart begins to chase relief from the world instead of seeking peace through divine connection. This shift leads to emotional exhaustion, because the world can never provide a type of peace that only Allah can give. Sikwah also isolates the believer spiritually. When the heart feels wronged by Allah, it withdraws emotionally. It may still perform acts of worship outwardly, but inwardly it feels distanced. Worship becomes heavy instead of soothing. Quran feels distant instead of healing. Salah feels like a ritual instead of a conversation with the most merciful. This spiritual isolation is one of the most painful consequences of complaint, because it deprives the soul of the nourishment it was created to live on. The believer may not realize why their worship feels empty, but the root often lies in unresolved complaint within the heart. Another subtle consequence is that sikwah disrupts the believer's relationship with others. When the heart feels disconnected from Allah, it becomes more sensitive, defensive, and easily hurt by people. The emotional resilience that reliance on Allah provides is no longer there. As a result, relationships become strained, misunderstandings increase, and small issues feel magnified. This creates a cycle where the person's internal spiritual weakness spills into their external interactions, leading to more emotional pain and further internal complaint. In addition, sikwah diminishes the believer's ability to recognize spiritual opportunities. Hardship often comes with hidden blessings, opportunities to grow in patience, deepen reliance, purify the soul, or draw closer to Allah. But a heart burdened with complaint cannot see these opportunities. It becomes fixated on the discomfort rather than the potential transformation. This blindness prevents the believer from experiencing the spiritual elevation that could have come through the trial. The hardship then becomes purely painful instead of meaningful, which further weakens trust and reliance. Lastly, the greatest disadvantage of sikwah is that it steals the believer's spiritual freedom. Freedom of the soul comes from trusting Allah with full surrender. It comes from letting go of the burdens the heart was never meant to carry alone. But complaint makes the heart cling to those burdens. It keeps the soul trapped in cycles of resentment, fear, and doubt. This bondage prevents the believer from experiencing the profound liberation that comes from saying internally and sincerely, I trust you, even when I do not understand. Sikwah blinds the believer to hidden wisdom and reshapes hardship into resentment instead of growth, not because wisdom is absent, but because the heart becomes unable to receive it. Hardship in life carries meanings far beyond what the human eye can capture. It holds insights that were placed within it with perfect precision, meant to guide, purify, elevate, and bring the soul closer to the one who crafted every emotion and every moment. But when complaint grows in the heart, especially complaint directed toward Allah, it covers those meanings with a veil that dims the light of understanding. The trial remains the same, the wisdom remains present, the divine plan remains flawless, but the heart can no longer interpret any of it correctly because its lens has become clouded by resentment. A heart engaged in sikwah becomes like a window fogged by the breath of its own disappointment. The world outside may still be beautiful, meaningful, purposeful, but the window prevents the believer from seeing the scene clearly. In the same way, complaint fogs the spiritual vision. So every hardship becomes exaggerated, every disappointment grows heavier, and every moment of confusion feels like evidence of abandonment rather than a step toward clarity. The heart, overwhelmed by the weight of its own protests, becomes too tired to perceive the subtle mercies that accompany every challenge. It begins to reject the possibility that something good could be growing beneath the surface of what it finds painful. Often, wisdom in hardship appears gradually. It is like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. The petals do not open in one moment. They shift, expand, and reveal themselves with gentle precision. But a heart that carries complaint cannot wait for this unfolding. It demands immediate ease, immediate clarity, immediate answers. And when these answers do not come quickly, resentment grows, pushing the believer further away from the quiet understanding that could have emerged had the heart remained patient. Hardship requires softness of spirit, but complaint hardens that softness. Instead of acceptance, there is agitation. Instead of surrender, there is resistance. And resistance prevents the soul from seeing the wisdom hidden inside the very thing it wants to escape. One of the most harmful effects of sikwah is that it reshapes how the believer interprets every moment of hardship. A test that was meant to teach patience becomes viewed as cruelty. A delay that was meant to protect becomes seen as neglect. A change that was meant to redirect the believer towards something better becomes misinterpreted as loss. This misinterpretation is not in the event itself, but in the heart's response. Two people can experience the same hardship, yet one grows from it, while the other collapses under the weight of resentment. The difference lies not in the trial, but in the ability to perceive divine wisdom within it. Complaint distorts this perception. It narrows the believer's attention until they can only see what they lack, what hurts, what feels unjust, or what seems unfair. It blocks them from noticing the gentle ways Allah softens the path, the hidden blessings that remain even in difficulty, the people who show up at the right time, the small mercies that cushion the blow, or the strength that grows inside them quietly. When the heart insists on focusing only on what feels painful, it becomes blind to what is still beautiful. This blindness deepens the trial, making it heavier than it was ever meant to be. When resentment grows, hardship becomes personal rather than purposeful. The believer begins to feel targeted by life. They start to interpret challenges as a reflection of their worth, rather than as a part of their journey. Instead of saying, "This is meant to shape me," the heart says, "This is happening because I am forgotten." Instead of seeing the hand of mercy guiding them, they see a hand withdrawing. These beliefs have nothing to do with the reality of Allah's mercy. They are reflections of a heart that has allowed complaint to build walls around it. Another consequence of sikwah is that it steals the ability to reflect. Reflection is the gateway to wisdom. It is through reflection that the believer recognizes patterns, connects events, notices divine signs, remembers past lessons, and finds serenity even in uncertainty. But when the heart is occupied with complaint, it becomes too noisy for reflection. Reflection requires quietness inside, the willingness to pause and listen. Complaint fills that space with agitation, preventing the heart from hearing the whispers of guidance that often come in moments of stillness. Sikwah also causes the believer to overlook the temporary nature of hardship. Every challenge has an expiration date, even if the heart cannot see it yet. But complaint makes difficulties feel permanent. It convinces the believer that the current pain is a never-ending reality, that relief is far away, and that their suffering is fixed. This illusion increases despair, and despair blinds the believer further. When the heart believes that a trial is endless, it stops looking for openings. And when it stops looking for openings, it fails to notice the doors that Allah quietly unlocks. Another dimension of blindness caused by sikwah is the inability to see how hardship is part of a larger divine design. Human beings often see life in fragments. They see one event, one moment, one disappointment, and interpret it on its own. But Allah's plan is written across years, across people, across circumstances the believer cannot yet imagine. A test that seems harsh today may be the reason for future blessings. A setback may redirect the believer away from something harmful. A loss may be preparing the heart for something greater. Complaint makes the believer judge the story before it is complete. It causes the heart to lose trust in chapters it has not yet read. Resentment is the emotional result of this premature judgment. When the heart complains against Allah, it becomes upset that life is not unfolding according to its expectations. It becomes frustrated that challenges exist at all. But growth requires friction. Diamonds are formed through pressure. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Souls are purified through trials. When the heart rejects the necessity of hardship, it also rejects the possibility of growth. And this rejection becomes the source of its suffering. Sikwah also blinds the believer to their own resilience. Hardship often reveals strengths the person did not know they possessed. It brings forth patience they never practiced before. It awakens courage hidden deep within. It helps them break attachments that were weighing them down. But when a believer is lost in complaint, they cannot see any of this. They interpret their endurance as misery rather than strength. They interpret their survival as evidence of abandonment instead of evidence of divine support. They fail to acknowledge the inner growth that is happening every single moment they choose to keep going despite their pain. Complaint also makes the believer misinterpret divine timing. One of the greatest wisdoms in hardship is timing. When things arrive, when they leave, when they shift, when they unfold. But sikwah makes the heart impatient and dismissive of timing. It convinces the believer that good things are delayed without purpose, or that difficulties are prolonged without wisdom. This interpretation leads to spiritual agitation, where the believer begins to rush destiny rather than trust it. But divine timing is not designed to frustrate. It is designed to prepare. A heart blinded by complaint cannot see this preparation. It only sees delay. Sikwah reshapes hardship into resentment by feeding a narrative of unfairness. The believer begins to compare their journey to others. They see people who seem to be thriving while they are struggling, and complaint magnifies this comparison. But comparisons are illusions. Everyone carries hidden trials. A heart rooted in complaint forgets this. It begins to imagine that Allah distributes hardship unevenly, forgetting that He knows every soul and crafts every trial with precision. Resentment grows when the heart refuses to acknowledge the wisdom behind this precision. Another aspect of blindness caused by sikwah is the inability to appreciate ease when it arrives. When a believer spends too much time complaining during hardship, they lose the sensitivity needed to recognize blessings. Even when relief comes, the heart remains tense, unable to feel joy. It expects disappointment, anticipates pain, and doubts happiness. This emotional numbness prevents the believer from enjoying the very blessings they once prayed